Mindset Game podcast, and I'm your host, James Roberts. I'm a two-time Paralympian, online training and nutrition coach, and owner of James Robert Fitness. You can find more of my content by going to my website, fitamputee.co.uk. But before we get started with today's show, first off, let me take this opportunity to welcome back the regular listeners. And if this is your first time listening to the show, I hope you enjoy this episode and decide to subscribe to the show. And on today's show, I've got Hayley Masters, a recent graduate of Northeastern Universities First Division 1 ice hockey program. She graduated with honors and a BA in journalism. She has been part of the Canadian Under-18 Hockey Development Program, both Team Ontario Red and Blue, and has a background in coaching and training young athletes. She's recently returned from playing professional ice hockey for EC Bergkamen in Germany. And as we record this episode from September 2018, attending Harvard's Graduate Extension School in Psychology. So welcome onto the show, Hayley.
Thank you so much, James. I'm excited to be here.
So before we delve into today's episode, Hayley, can you talk about, obviously, I know most people would associate ice hockey with Canadians, but what was the kind of the driving factor for you wanting to get to the sport in the first place?
I started playing hockey when I was, I think it was a year or 2 years old. My dad played hockey growing up. I had two older cousins that played, and it kind of just, my parents said, here's your first pair of skates. And I fell in love with the game when I was really, really young. And I played hockey, boys hockey specifically growing up. And it was always competitive. And my parents, wanted me to be so well-rounded. And so I played golf, I snowboarded, I played tennis. And so, I had, my toes dipped in different ponds with, the athletic community. But essentially, that was where my passion was. And that was the center focus of my athletic career. And I think it took off, and I was fortunate enough to play, for Team Ontario. And then I went to boarding school in Toronto. And so I moved out of my house essentially when I was 14, which was, looking back, pretty young. But again, it was to pursue my passion with hockey. And then following that was university. So I got to play, in Boston on one of the top Division I teams, which is incredible. And then, it took me all the way to Germany to play in the German First League. So, I owe so much of my life to the sport, but it's always been a passion of mine, and I'm incredibly grateful for, the overall experiences and the people I've met, obviously, along the way, and just how it's, really, really shaped me as a person and been a vehicle for so many different avenues that now I'm taking on.
And you talked there about, obviously, your love for psychology, and this is to get your opinion on probably the obsession that the Canadians and, say, the northern states of the US have with this, what you could say to a certain extent, an obsession with ice hockey. Where do you think that comes from?
The history of the game, goes way back. And I think, I just think it's such a competitive culture, and it's such a unique sport, because you think, let's say tennis, for example, it's skating is such a difficult thing to do, I think. And a lot of people don't or can't grasp that until they put a pair of skates on, get on the ice and go, whoa, it's balance, it's technical skills, it's physicality, it's the mental game. There's just so many components. Not to mention the timing of it. It's fast-paced, it's high speed, and in men's hockey specifically, there's contact and there's fighting. So it's kind of like a combination of so many different things, and it becomes, you can obviously develop your skills in any sport specifically, but I think hockey is one of those things that it's, and that's not to say other sports don't require the same, technical skill set, but I think hockey, it's fun, it's competitive, and it takes a lot of effort and work and preparation to really master it. And so I think the competitive culture, whether it's between, you see in the Olympics, the U.S. and the Canadians, or, even in the NHL, you see Montreal and Toronto, or, Toronto and Boston, you see these rivalries, and it's just such a community that really Canada and, you know, the US have really cultivated around this, you know, this competitive edge. And I think it's kind of like Europe with soccer, football, as it's called. And when I came to Germany, I didn't understand, you know, the football culture until you go in a stadium and there's 80,000 people that are, you know, absolutely crazed and so passionate about it. And I think, you know, that culture is similar to the culture in Canada and the States. And I think, you know, you see the numbers every year increasing of young athletes joining the sport. And the numbers, I mean, let's say the last 20 years, every single year, there's more and more, especially female athletes joining the sport and male athletes joining the sport. And it's, you know, the communities are growing. And I think, you know, the hockey world now is not just in Canada and not just in the States, but it's going worldwide. And you see this with the Olympic development teams, and, you know, they're bringing in Canadians and Americans and specialists, and they're growing their programs because it is, you know, obviously it's my favorite sport, and it's, you know, something that I absolutely love. But again, I think it's traveling so far across the world, and you know, I didn't expect it, but now, you know, China has an incredible development team, and there was two teams that went over from Canada that now were playing in China for a full year to develop their Olympic program, but also to develop our, you know, our players. And you see, you know, even in the NCAA, you have people from everywhere. You have, you know, Russian students, and you have, you know, people from all over the globe coming to a, you know, to share a common passion and a common goal. And I think you're going to continue to see that, you know, in the next, you know, I think throughout history is just the sport is so popular because of, you know, I mean, how awesome it is, really.
And in terms of, I had the opportunity to watch it. The winter games just gone.
Yeah.
Can you kind of, for the listeners that possibly didn't have the opportunity to watch it, what are like some of the variations between the men and women's game? Because there is. I couldn't grasp it to some extent because some of the rule changes they've got between the two, you think, well, maybe you could adapt it slightly and then let them still play, whereas that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, specifically male hockey or men's hockey is contact. So it's body contact. There's allowed checking, and so those are open ice collisions. Or, you know, if someone's up against the board, you can make full contact. Whereas the women's game, there's no contact whatsoever. And that's not to say it's not, you know, if you're battling for the puck, there is contact, and it's a very physical sport. But the open ice collisions and the fighting is, you know, it doesn't take place in the female game based on the rule set. So I think that's really the only, you know, major difference between men and women's hockey. And I think, you know, because there's no contact in women's hockey, it's genuinely, you know, about speed. And so because you can't make that physical play, and even as a, you know, playing as a forward in boys hockey when I played, you'd go down the ice and you're constantly, you know, fearing somebody making contact, because if you have the puck, it's open season. Anybody can hit you, obviously not from behind. And there's, you know, there's rules about how to make a proper hit, and there's, you know, obviously hitting from behind is not okay. And there's, you know, different types of head checks that are, you know, not allowed in either the male or female game. But the girls' game, there's no fear, because, you know, if you have the puck, there's no, you know, it's not allowed. And if someone does choose to make contact or, you know, engage in that type of physical play, there's going to be repercussions, and that's when, you know, penalties or even suspensions will occur. But other than that, the rules are pretty similar. I mean, the men typically play on bigger ice sheets, so the NHL size arenas. But that varies because in the Olympics, they play on the same ice, which is, you know, the traditional Olympic size rinks, and the females and the males play on that. Yeah, I think that's the only real thing that's the difference is the contact of male and female ice hockey.
But Hayley, you talked about there obviously coming up through the male version of the game from a psychological state of mind. That's got to have an impact on the individual coming up, because if you've got one set of rules and this is how you've been brought up with it, and then it shifts, is there kind of a shift you've got to make as an individual to then adapt.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I played boys hockey till I think it was 12 or 13. And I was a super tomboy back in the day. I mean, I still am, but it was that competitive nature. And my dad taught me from a young age how to make a hit, but how to receive a hit. And at that point, at 13, 14, size wasn't an issue. I was tall for my age. And so the physical component, I was equal in height and weight approximately with most of the guys on my team. But again, I was trained how to make contact, and my game was very much revolving around being able, to take the hits and give the hits. And so when I made my transition to the girls' game, I struggled. And even through university, I always struggled with that, because if you're going into the corner to battle someone, my first instinct was make the hit, engage in contact, make the hit, and then get the puck. Versus the women's game, you go in and you lift the stick, and there's that initial contact is not made. And so, even took me all the way to Germany to say, the first instinct cannot be make the hit. It's got to be go for the puck. And so that transition, I mean, it depended, because, even at Northeastern, there was some teams and some referees that would let that go. And it could be, there was games that it was incredibly physical, and you'd think that there would be, the referees calling penalties, and they wouldn't. And then some referees, you brush up against somebody and it's a 2-minute, body checking. So, I mean, it really depended. But like you said, yeah, the mental part of it is just wrapping your head around, the different styles of games. And again, carrying the puck, it's, in the female game, you're not in fear, and you're not constantly looking around going, if I receive the puck here, who's 2 feet in front of me to make that hit? It's, I can receive, you just have more time, I think is essentially what it is. But for any female athlete, I think that has a training in male or grows up playing with boys, that transition is difficult. And oftentimes they are the goon on the team, if, for lack of, a better word, is, they're the tough guy. And they're, if the game becomes physical, you're the first one in there, engaging in it, because, you've been trained in it. And that's just part of, my game. And that was, even when I was getting recruited, they always said, we love your physical presence on the ice. We love how physical you are. And some coaches would say, there's no place for that in female hockey, and they'd rather see the finesse and the more talent with regard to stick handling and different skill sets. But some coaches, they love the fact that, you can engage in that contact, and you can, be respectful of the rules, but also you're trained in that, in the sense that you need to be thinking faster and quicker, and the boys' game trains that. They train that side of, you have to be quick, and your decisions have to be a split second faster, because if not, someone's coming after you. And so, it's based on the referees, the coaches, but for me mentally, yeah, I mean, I struggled with that my entire career, of just saying, okay, Hayley, it's not male hockey. If you make contact here, you're going to be in the penalty box the whole game. And there was games that, I'd have 10 minutes or, plus in penalties, because I couldn't turn it off. And it was, again, you trust your instinct, you trust your gut, you go in the corner, you make a hit, and you're looking going, uh-oh, this isn't boys hockey, this is girls hockey. And that's, that's prohibited. That's not allowed. So.
But then it's, in terms of, we could say it's black and white in terms of the rules. But from, if we come from the athlete perspective now, you've got kind of a fork in the road in terms of where the athlete can start their career. Right. Do they go into predominantly, be it, in most cases, there's only going to be boys hockey that's going to be available. Do they go in that route to be able to get into the sport first of all, or do they go into the girls' sport, which is happening probably more and more in other sports nowadays, and be, say, sport specific from then don't have to overcome that hurdle that you talked about later down the road? But then, would you say a little bit that it loses its essence of what hockey is, and maybe they should tweak it slightly, because the hits, in my opinion, will not be as vicious? But then you might disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think essentially it comes down to, I mean, for young and youth hockey, where you're located is so important, because if you're located in the middle of, Northern Ontario, and there's not an established or developed female program, then, if your dad played and you have older brothers, or, that's the only place you can play, they're going to play. If that's what they want to do and they want to engage in the sport of hockey, then they're going to play on a boys team until, either they decide that, yeah, it's just a hobby and we'll just play on a house league team, which is the lowest level, and that sometimes can be co-ed, or they're going to take their game to the next level, and at that point, there's a cutoff, and I think it's 13 years old. If you want to play on Team Canada or Team Ontario, you have to be registered with the Ontario Women's Hockey League. So you can't be playing boys hockey and then come back and play on the female Team Ontario. So there are rules and regulations that now have been established for that purpose. But youth hockey, I mean, if the girl, a lot of the young girls don't want to play with the boys, they want to play with their friends, and it's more of a social event, and that's totally fine. Yeah, I coach at a summer camp, and the girls, you find 95% of the girls love, the social of in the locker room, and we get to talk about this and that, and then there's the other 5% that say, no, we want to play with the boys, we're competitive, this is what we want to do, and they're talented enough that they can play with the boys and establish themselves and still develop, and not be less skilled or less talented and kind of fall behind, and their development could be hindered by that. But I think the rules of the female game, I don't think they're going to change. I think if anything, the men's game is taking a route now that, they don't want fighting anymore because of concussions and because of injuries. And they're really taking a step back, and especially with the NHL saying, fighting, there's no place for fighting. 35, 40 years ago, it was bench clearing brawls, and there was no, I don't want to say science, or, I guess science behind concussions, but with technology today and the research that's come forward about, impact and the devastating effects of concussions, they're trying to remove it or at least minimize it from the game. And the referees are being very strict about that now at the highest levels, and even in, youth development of, you can't make contact to the head. There's no fighting allowed. And so I think the girls' game is where the men's game, it's not going to transition completely, because there's always going to be contact in, male hockey. But I think they're becoming more strict about the head contact, especially because there's so many, whether it's hockey or football or any of these contact sports, you're seeing the repercussions, not, some guys will, it'll end their career early, but 10, 15, 20 years from now, they can't remember their name. They can't, they can't track with their eyes. There's so much damage that's done to the brain in a concussion. And so I think that specifically, if you are a young girl playing boys hockey, you'd hope that a parent would say, okay, their size, they're 9 years old. Their size is about the same, their weight. And if she doesn't feel comfortable, obviously, putting her into female hockey. But if she is, I mean, like myself, same weight, same talent level, and you can still develop and grow and not be, injured or a liability, then, by all means. But I really do think the game, especially for the boys, is going to take a turn in the sense that, they should be stricter on the rules, because it's people's health you're dealing with, and it's, long-term effects that really need to be, focused, and they need to be important, because, like I said, you have guys that are, 20 years retired and, facing so many critical health, and not just mental, but psychological and physical damage from concussions and from that contact that the male sport, typically engenders.
And obviously, we touched upon this briefly, that you've gone on to like the exploits of further education within psychology.
Yeah.
When do you think that kind of passion first appeared? Do you think it's related and intertwined with that of sport, or is that me generalizing a little bit?
To be honest, I kind of came about my passion for psychology, and more so the mental side of the game, and applying psychology to sport. And that was my avenue. Was, for so long, I never, to be honest, cared about the mental side. It was, you show up to the arena, you put your equipment on, you go out there and you work hard for 60 minutes, and that's that. And then, there was girls on my team that were, that established their, let's say, mental game earlier on, and they were watching video, and they were, they had their routines, and they had their, whether it was meditation or whatever you want to call it, their pregame rituals. And part of me, early on in my career was going, what are these girls doing? Just go out there and score goals, go out there and play, But I think it was later on in my college career that I started saying, wow, this stuff works. And we were lucky enough to have a sports psychologist that worked with our specific team. And I met with him multiple times, and him and I established a great relationship, because by my senior year, it was, once a week or once every 2 weeks going in and figuring out strategies for how can I maximize my performance? How can I maximize, sleep patterns, and just paying attention on purpose to these things. And when I went to Germany, that's really when I said, okay, I don't have, a trainer. I don't have coaches that are, holding me accountable. It's, if I want to maximize, my game, it's on me. And so how can I do that? Well, I'm going to establish a great routine, and that it was rooted in, psychology essentially, and just saying, how can I manipulate my brain, or how can I manipulate my routine that's going to benefit me and be most effective towards my performance. And I think it was kind of an organic process, but the more that I, really focused on the mental side of it and the psychology behind it, the more my game took off and evolved to different levels that I didn't, think were possible. Something as simple as, being on the bench and focusing on my breath for just tuning in for 10 seconds and being mindful of it. And that, that alone, you calm down, you can refocus, and just little things that I was able to tweak, from a psychological standpoint, that allowed me to perform at a different level, and a level I never reached previous to that.
So you're telling me, Hayley, you had no superstitions whatsoever in your early career then?
I mean, putting my equipment on, I always tied my left skate first. I always went left to right. So I'd put on my left side on first, and then my right side. I taped my stick a certain way. And I always, on the top of it, had, my brother, my mom, my dad, their initials on it. And there were certain things, specific music that I would play. But those were more just feel goods. And, if I'd walk to the arena playing a certain song, it would put me in a mood that, was beneficial to me. But then, when I started researching flow states, which I'm sure you're aware of, and being able to, create an environment that's conducive for a flow state, and realizing you can manipulate, you have control over, the environment to get yourself, into that flow state. And once I figured out, what that environment was for me, because it's going to be different for everybody, what works for me and what gets me motivated and prepared for a competition or an event is going to be different than what gets you prepared. And so when that, kind of came into fruition of, oh, wow, what works for this professional athlete that I listened to a podcast on, or I read a book on what this person does, that's fantastic. But you need to really do some self-exploration to figure out what makes you tick, what's going to get you ready, and what's going to put you in an optimal environment to get into that flow state. Because, I've played hundreds and hundreds of hockey games, and let's say 1% of those are in your flow state. And you often just think, oh, I must have had a great dinner last night, and I got my good 8 hours of sleep, and I must have just played well. But if you really break that down, you can look into the nutrition behind it, what micro macronutrients you had the night before, what specific playlist did you have on, did you ice bath, did you hot tub, what exactly. And you can, by the end of it, I got it down to a science of, if I want to play at my absolute peak performance, this, and this need to happen in order for me to get into that state. And I was able to get into flow state, I'd say on the upside of 80% of my games in Germany. We only had, I think, 30 games in the season, which was a lot less than I did at Northeastern. But there wasn't too many games that, and even if I wasn't in flow state the entire game, I would touch into it on multiple occasions during the game, and I knew how to get into it, and then I knew how to recover from it. Because putting your body and your mind through that intensity, it would take me I'd say 2 or 3 days to mentally and psychologically and also physically recover from that. But again, it was rooted in the psychology and just having a specific routine that was going to allow me to perform, at my peak consistently and constantly throughout my season.
But some might say, Hayley, obviously with the shift patterns that hockey brings,
yeah,
isn't it more? From my opinion, it would bring more difficulties to be able to stay in that flow state because you've got prolonged periods that you're on and off the ice. And I would say it's probably one of the more difficult sports to be totally engaged 100% of the time.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, because it is, you're on the ice for, let's say, between 45 and a minute and 20 seconds, and then you're off. And, depending on the game, depending on your role in the team, you could be sitting for 5 minutes, 30 seconds, 10 minutes, or, 15 minutes, depending on, like I said, your role on the team. And so that was, it is tough because when you're on the ice and engaged in the physical component of actually playing, it's easy to be in flow state. Not easy, but you're physically and mentally all there. So when you do come off the ice, that was, the first little while I was figuring out, okay, once I can settle and be on the bench and be, a spectator watching until my turn, comes up next, how can I maintain that level of intensity, but also be recovering at the same time physically and maintaining that mental state of, if you come off the ice, you can't be, obviously you need to be hydrating and focusing, but a lot of the time I'd come off the ice and, you'd be thinking about 10 million things and you get distracted, and then you'd go back out on the ice and it would take the first 15 seconds to get back and re-engaged. And so that was again, something I struggled with at the beginning until I found, okay, coming off the bench, paying attention to my breath, taking, 6 or 7 really deep focused breaths, hydrating, and I was able to keep my mental, capacity to say, okay, even though your body's in rest mode, your mind is still engaged and you're still in a state where once you get on the ice and once you engage physically, you can return to that flow state.
I'm trying to think of examples where there'd be sports that are similar. The ones that come to mind would be basketball, field hockey. It's predominantly team sports, but then there's some occasions, and probably the likes, you can manipulate it in a competitive environment, probably in all of them.
Right. I mean, any sport really, it's to keep in flow state, whether it's, golf, you look at golfers, for example, that's a 4-hour round of playing 18 holes and you got to be tuned in for 4 hours. I struggle with 60 minutes minus the time. Out of 60 minutes, I'm probably only physically engaged in 30 minutes. And of that 30 minutes, you're not going to be in flow state for that entire 30 minutes. Once in a while you'll get into it and you'll maintain and you'll be at your optimal flow state. But for a golfer who's playing for 4+ hours, how do you stay in that flow state for that long? And I think that just comes down to, mental agility and really training and having, repetition with it to say, okay, even if I, come out of flow state for a bit, how can I, still maintain that level of compete and that level of, intensity and that level of focus. But I think every sport requires, the psychology or the willingness to say, okay, it's not just a physical game. Sports are physical, but the mental component to sport is indispensable. And without it, you're not going to excel personally, but you look at the best athletes in the world, the best programs, the best teams, mental, mental toughness, mental strength, the mental component of sport is now equal, I would say, to the physical components. And you see, professional organizations now hiring, sports psychologists, yoga instructors, mindfulness coaches, because there is, a place for that. And I think, 20 years ago, it wasn't as, today it's backed up by research and science. It's saying without the mental component and without being completely solid, between your ears, you can't reach that next level. You can't be as successful as, the best athletes in the world, because their mental game is on another level, I
think this flows nicely into my next question, Hayley. In terms of, obviously, we touched upon it, oh gosh, I think it's about maybe a month or two ago now that you emailed me in terms of asking me questions. But as you were looking to write the book called The Space Between the Ears, you probably touched upon it a little bit there. Why do you think it has got such an important place within sport?
So the book essentially it started off for me, and I wanted to track how I was going to finish my hockey career in my final season and try and be the best I could be mentally, because I'd never really put an importance, or I'd never really focused on the mental side of it. And so it started off kind of as, how was I going to optimize my mental game? And so through the process of that, I started doing, a lot of research on it and listening to podcasts and reading books and getting the research, the solid scientific research behind, mindfulness is what it essentially was. And that I define that as being intentionally centered in, grounded by, and on time for the present moment, with this radical acceptance and awareness of what you're doing and how you're doing it, and just being so open to, feelings and thoughts and emotions, but being able to control that. And so I think, when I was starting this book off, I myself was, kind of the blueprint for it. I said, I'm going to take these things that I'm learning and I'm acquiring and the knowledge that I'm gaining and apply that to my game and see what works. And once I kind of got into it, it started flowing, and I had, I was talking to friends and different teammates at the time and saying, does this work for you? Does this not work for you? And so, my teammates were essentially my little guinea pigs in this mastermind project of saying, okay, so I'm identifying what she does, and that works for her, but it doesn't work for the girl next to her. And it kind of just became this, this research project for me. And the more I started, I have a journalism background because that was my, what I studied in university, my BA. And so the writing came easy for me. It was the application part of it that said, okay, how can I apply, there's so many people that'll say a million different things about whether it's, the mental side of it, or nutrition, or, proper meditation techniques, or different things that work for different athletes. And it was kind of filtering through all of these incredible resources and saying, how can I apply this to sport? Because a lot of the research I did, it had no application to sport yet. It was about, meditation practices and yoga and, even Buddhist, traditional Buddhist practice. And the first chapter was essentially, I created a chart that said, what is mindfulness and what is, these mental toughness and mental components involved. And then the second part of the chart was, and how does this apply to sport? Because without that application, you even, let's take, mindfulness or meditation, for example, there is scientific evidence that says, this is going to benefit your health, your well-being, all these incredible things, but I never found in my research the application to sport. And that's where kind of the niche that I found was take all these incredible mental concepts and how to strengthen your mental game and how to deal with adversity and obstacles that athletes face, and how to use these incredible psychological backgrounds and apply those to sport specifically. And that's really kind of how the book or the idea came into fruition. And then I contacted you, of course, and then a few other, people in this space just to see, is this being applied to sport? Are these, interesting concepts? And is this psychology really, can it benefit and be helpful to athletes? And that's when I said this book, shouldn't just be for myself, because I think there's so much, room in this specific field to not only help others, but mentor others and just share the information that's acquired. And that's why, connecting with you was so fantastic, because you have your story and you have, the incredible things you do. And yours is a combination, your podcast is a combination of, the nutrition, the psychological barriers, it's an all encompassing look on, the mental side of sport. And it's not just, again, you can't just show up and go compete. There's a whole nother game that so many people, and so many athletes don't even realize. And if that's what I can do to give back and just share that information with young athletes, because I would have loved to know this stuff when I was entering college instead of, 4 years after, when I'm looking back going, man, if I had just, paid attention on purpose early on, what would my career look like, and how much different would it have been, and how would I have been able to, better interact with my teammates, or, be more coachable, or apply these different techniques to be, an all-around better athlete, not just on the ice, but off the ice. And I think, that's essentially what the book is, when it gets published and when it's, finalized, is just sharing that information, because again, it's their universal concepts, and it's, again, it's rooted in the psychology, but it can be applied in so many different ways into so many areas of your game and who you are as a person, not just, in the arena or in the stadium.
I think, Hayley, my example is probably very, very similar. I think, to my knowledge, earlier in my career, I probably did have that idea that, you just show up and the performance happens. Right. But it probably wasn't until, I would say, maybe when I went to university and did sports science, and then that love for sports psychology came about.
Right.
And it was a little bit, you could say, haphazardly, like that trial and error, finding ways, well, what I'm learning on my course, what can I implement into the sport, and what can I learn from an assignment point of view, or put it into theory, so to speak, from what I'm really living. So I think they're two intertwined, and I think very much, it's made me who I am now, and I'm very much, people might be not of the positive approach towards, say, mindfulness. The other one eludes me. And that kind of stuff, like the more spiritual aspect of what the psychology and all that can bring.
Right.
I'll probably touch upon it more from my humble beginnings with sport. Right. I can relate it more, and it's probably intertwines a little bit better with fitness and health, with the sporting connotations, because in essence it's the same thing. So I can probably touch more a nerve or a chord with that person, because it's probably more on that wavelength, and thus people are probably more understanding. This, you can kind of see the significance better than, say, if I said how you need to sit in a corner and hum to yourself, or I don't know, we'll say a couple of minutes, whereas it's finding, like you touched upon, what works for you. So what works for me, there might be a small percentage that there's going to be a similarity, but in most cases there's not.
And again, I think it's, regardless of what sport you're playing, if you're playing competitive sports, you're going to find that there's, whether your routine is different or the same to the person next to you, you're going to find similarities, because you're competitive. You have that innate desire to compete and be successful and win. And I think, that's what unites all athletes of all ages and, all genders and all sports, is just that desire to want to win and to battle and to sacrifice, and what you're going to give to the sport. But again, like you said, the routines are so different. And if if there's a young athlete standing in front of both of us and we both share our stories, he might, I'm not familiar, let's say, with the nutritional components. And yes, I mean, I've worked with nutritionists before, and I've, created, food plans, nutrition logs, and I'm now familiar. But your expertise, Netta, he may say, wow, I really don't eat well. And before a hockey game, I'm eating pizza and I can't skate out there. And so when you talk about, your routine to get yourself in, an environment conducive for a flow state or for, a high performance, he may pick up and say, that's what I need. Or he may look at me and say, wait, can you teach me that breathing stuff? Because I come off the ice and I'm panting and I can't catch my breath, and then I get back out on the next shift and I'm already tired, and so there's different parts of his game that, I think, like you said, all athletes are different and everyone's coming from different, physical and mental, backgrounds. And I think the more we can just be open in this space of psychology and sport and cross-pollinating these different areas, I think that we can, collectively, not just, you and I, but, the bigger community is working, to help athletes, understand the importance of that mental game. Because like we both agreed, if we had this, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, before we started paying attention to it, where would our careers be? What athletes would we be? What people would we be? I mean, I think you can take it down to that level of, if you were to pay attention to this early on in your life, would it have shaped, who you became later on? And these, I mean, those are deep, philosophic questions that you can, ponder at another time. But I think essentially, you see that, psychology has such an important role in sports, and whether that be nutritional or, meditation or different, workout routines and focusing on breath. And, there's just so much that is behind the scenes of just, showing up, putting your skates on and going and competing. And if you can really cultivate a routine that, that enables you to perform at your best level and be a great person and a great athlete and a great teammate and do all these things, then, I see the future of sport continuing to put a huge importance on the mental side of it and not just the physical side that I think history, shows that, it was purely physical, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And that, if someone were to say, what does your pregame routine look like? What did you eat for dinner last night? Did you focus on these specific things? An athlete might laugh at you and say, I just showed up today and I played the game of my life. Well, today there's, the science behind it that'll say, well, actually, there are things you can do and things you can eat and, different routines that can, force you and sometimes without even knowing to get into that state of, of excellence.
But I think you can go probably a step further, Hayley, in terms of from an athlete perspective, they've got this an added tool, so to speak, because when they're growing up, they've got a role model they want to emulate or a certain group of peers that they're going to, from a skill-based sport or whatever it may be, they're going to pick and choose different aspects from that individual. So I think from the mental side, it's a little bit like that. It's picking and choosing off how I would generally is off a shelf. You're going to pick this imaginary book. Off this imaginary bookcase, you're going to pick books that you so decide which will be in tune with how you are as a person, and probably get the best out of it. And it's very much, I would say, looking at the similarities where you do from a both physical and both skill set and applying it to the mental side.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, to each his own, and like we've agreed on so many times, what works for me isn't, it may work for you, but it might not work for you. And, the role models that I look up to, there are female athletes that I aspire to be like, and there's male athletes. And then there's, people that are non-athletes that I aspire to be like. And there's, those are both female and male. And the age is, it ranges from, people that are around my age, and there's people that are 75 that I aspire to be like. And again, it's because of who I am as a person and what experiences in life that I've had that, innately or, naturally draws me towards that person or that, that psychological training or whatever it may be, because of my experiences in my life and how I'm, how I've evolved as a person. And I think, your experiences would force you to, be drawn to different things. And I think that's what makes teams, I think, so interesting, is that you have a group of 23 people that are, could be polar opposites. Everybody's got a different story. Everybody has a different, upbringing. Everybody has a different physical, body capacity. Everybody has a different mental psyche and opinions and perspective. And then, when you see those, those incredibly successful organizations and teams, at the end of the day, again, it's that innate desire to be successful and put the person beside you first. And, and I think the best teams in the world are those that it's not about me. There's no ego involved. It's that selfless, something bigger than myself.
And my final question for you, Hayley, before we wrap up the episode today.
Yeah.
If you have to summarize what we've been speaking about into one sentence for people to take away, what would that be?
It's a great question. Cultivating a routine that works for you and that maximizes your physical, your mental, emotional performance, but at the end of the day, being proud of the person you are, not just the athlete. And I think I could go on for hours. We could talk about this for hours, but I think, at the end of the day, just having, being aware, and if you want to get to that level of, high competition and being a competitive athlete in that space, then really taking some time to reflect on, what you're good at, what you're not good at, your strengths and weaknesses, how you can improve. And the more self-aware you are, the more you're going to be able to recognize those flaws or those weaknesses and build upon them, and recognize your strengths and say, okay, I can continue to grow and evolve and develop as an athlete, but, off the field as a person too.
So once again, Hayley, thanks for coming on the Mindset Game podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure. You are fantastic, and I'm such a big fan of the work you do.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming on. And before I forget, I would really appreciate it if you would be so kind as to leave a short written review, as it helps to get the podcast more notoriety, and it would be more visible in future to others, and thus helping more people, which my guests and I are all about. Once again, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time for another episode of the Mindset Game podcast.